He touched the wrong woman, and the quiet man beside her changed the room forever. Harlem, 1948. The air carried music before it carried fear. Saxophones bled through open windows. Children chased each other past brownstones glowing gold under street lamps. Women leaned from second-floor balconies, calling sons home in voices soft but commanding. Harlem was bruised, yes, but it was proud. It held its head high, even when the world tried to press it down. And that night, the Renaissance ballroom pulsed like a heartbeat. Inside, nearly 200 people gathered for a community fundraiser. It wasn't about wealth, it was about survival. School books, winter coats, a safe after-school program. Harlem took care of its own because too often no one else would. At the center of the room stood Bumpy Johnson. He wasn't loud, he didn't need to be. He wore a tailored dark suit, perfectly pressed. His posture was still, deliberate. His eyes, sharp, observant, missed nothing. People respected him, but not because he demanded it. They respected him because when Harlem needed something done, it got done. Beside him stood his wife, Mamie. Elegant, graceful, a quiet strength wrapped in silk and pearls. When she smiled, it wasn't decoration, it was warmth. She knew every child's name in the neighborhood. She knew which families were struggling. She was the kind of woman who made other women stand taller. That night, she wore cream satin gloves and a soft gold dress that shimmered when she moved. Not flashy, just dignified. And dignity is what made the moment that followed feel like a crack in the earth. The ballroom doors opened. The music faltered, not stopped, just faltered, like a musician missing a note. A group of white men stepped inside. They weren't invited. Their presence wasn't subtle. Heavy boots, hard faces, cold eyes scanning a room they clearly didn't believe they should have to share. Conversations thinned, laughter quieted. The men moved with deliberate provocation, brushing shoulders too hard, smirking at discomfort. One of them, a tall man with a sneer carved into his face, locked eyes on Mamie. He didn't see her as a person. He saw a challenge. He walked toward her slowly, pushing past tables without apology. The room stiffened. 200 people, watching. The man stepped too close. "Didn't know this place was hosting royalty tonight," he said, voice dripping with mockery. Mamie didn't step back. She didn't flinch. She held his gaze calmly. "We're hosting community," she replied. The word hit like a boundary line. He didn't like boundaries. His hand shot out. Not violently, not striking, but grabbing. He wrapped his fingers around her gloved wrist. And the music stopped, completely. 200 people froze, not because of fear alone, because of what it meant. It wasn't just a hand on a wrist. It was disrespect. It was humiliation. It was the world trying, again, to remind them of their place. But what happened next didn't involve a punch. It didn't involve shouting. It involved something far more powerful. Bumpy Johnson stepped forward. Not fast, not dramatic, just forward. His hand rested gently over the man's grip, not yanking, not striking, just resting there, firm, unmovable. His voice was low. "Remove your hand." No anger, no tremor, just certainty. The tall man smirked. Or what? And this is the moment that made 200 people stand completely still. Because Bumpy didn't answer with violence, he answered with presence. "You don't understand where you are," Bumpy said softly. "This room, these people, they've built something with nothing, and you walked in thinking you could take dignity the way you take space." His grip tightened, not crushing, just undeniable. "You will let go." There was something in his eyes, not rage, conviction.
The kind of conviction that says, "You will not reduce us." The tall man tried to laugh it off, but he felt it. He felt the room behind Bumpy. 200 people, standing, not running, not looking away, standing. And something shifted, because intimidation only works when people shrink. That night, no one shrank. The man slowly released Mamie's wrist. The glove slipped free. Mamie straightened her posture, not shaken, not angry, simply steady. Bumpy stepped closer, lowering his voice so only the man could hear. "You will leave," he said, "and you will not return. Not because I say so, but because you now understand this is not a place you can break." Silence stretched. The other men hesitated, but the leader felt it. He was no longer the biggest presence in the room. The room was. He stepped back, one step, then another, and without another word, they turned and walked out. The doors closed, and for a moment, no one breathed. Then Mamie lifted her chin and said gently, "Let's continue." The saxophone resumed, soft at first, then stronger. Applause broke out, not for a fight, not for dominance, but for composure, for dignity, for refusing to collapse. Later that night, as guests filtered out, a familiar figure approached Bumpy. Joe Louis, the heavyweight champion of the world, a man who had fought in rings under brighter lights than any ballroom chandelier, a man who understood what it meant to represent more than yourself. Joe placed a hand on Bumpy's shoulder. "You didn't swing," Joe said quietly. Bumpy glanced toward Mamie, who was laughing with a group of children near the refreshment table. "No," Bumpy replied, "because sometimes strength isn't about hitting back." Joe nodded. They expected a fight. They expected us to prove them right. Joe smiled slightly. And instead, Bumpy's eyes softened. We proved them small. Outside, the night air felt different, not because the world had changed, but because Harlem had been reminded of something powerful. Dignity doesn't need permission, and courage isn't loud. Sometimes it's simply refusing to bow. That night, 200 people stood completely still, not out of fear, but out of unity. And the man who grabbed Mamie's wrist, he walked away understanding something he'd never expected. Power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just stands.
They tried to squeeze Harlem quietly, but they underestimated what it had already become. The rally did not end the tension, it changed its shape. When intimidation fails in public, it moves into private corridors. Within weeks, Harlem began to feel a different kind of pressure, less visible, more calculated. Credit lines for small businesses were suddenly delayed. A grocery supplier claimed inventory shortages that only seemed to affect stores inside the neighborhood. A local insurance office quietly raised premiums for certain storefronts without explanation. None of it was dramatic enough to headline a newspaper, but together it formed a pattern. Someone had decided that if Harlem would not bow publicly, it would be bent economically. Bumpy saw it before most did. Power, he knew, rarely announces itself when it shifts tactics. He began meeting with shop owners individually, listening more than speaking. A tailor on 135th Street explained how his loan renewal had been postponed without reason. A bookstore owner described how a shipment of textbooks had been rerouted. A restaurant manager admitted that vendors had begun demanding payment up front when they had once extended trust. Fear wasn't spreading in loud waves. It was creeping quietly, like fog slipping under doors. Joe Louis, meanwhile, was traveling for exhibitions and public appearances, but he stayed in close contact. Fame gave him access to rooms that Harlem business owners could not enter. He began asking questions during private dinners with sponsors and corporate representatives. His tone was never confrontational, but it was direct. "Funny how supply issues seem selective," he remarked casually at one gathering. "Wouldn't want it to look intentional." When a heavyweight champion raises an eyebrow in a room full of executives, it carries weight no punch could replicate. Still, the pressure continued. One evening, Mamie returned home later than usual. She had spent the afternoon visiting families who were feeling the squeeze most acutely. A widow with 3 children had just lost her job at a laundry service that suddenly downsized. A high school senior had been told that his scholarship paperwork was incomplete despite confirmation weeks earlier. The pattern was expanding beyond business into opportunity. Mamie placed her gloves carefully on the table and looked at Bumpy with steady eyes. "They're not trying to scare us," she said quietly. "They're trying to exhaust us." That realization shifted everything. Fear can unite people quickly, but exhaustion divides them slowly. If enough families became overwhelmed by small setbacks, unity could fracture without a single public confrontation. Harlem's strength was collective resilience, and someone was testing its endurance. The following week, Bumpy convened a closed-door meeting at a community center. No spectacle, no press, just barbers, teachers, pastors, shopkeepers, and youth mentors sitting in metal folding chairs beneath flickering fluorescent lights. Joe Louis attended quietly, wearing a simple overcoat, blending in as much as a global champion could. Bumpy stood at the front, hands clasped behind his back, not as a ruler, but as a coordinator. He laid out the facts without dramatics. Loans delayed, supplies restricted, insurance increased, employment opportunities withdrawn. He didn't speculate publicly about motives. He didn't name enemies. Instead, he asked a question that reframed the room. What do we control? The question shifted posture. Instead of focusing on external pressure, the room began listing internal assets. Skilled tradesmen, seamstresses, teachers willing to tutor without pay, church kitchens capable of feeding dozens if necessary, musicians who could organize fundraising concerts, a retired accountant who understood the banking system intimately, a small printing press owner who could produce flyers and newsletters without outside contracts. Joe listened, impressed. He had fought opponents who underestimated him before, but what he saw here was an entire community refusing to underestimate itself. Within days, a cooperative network began forming quietly beneath the surface of Harlem. Shop owners agreed to source goods from one another whenever possible. Credit was extended internally, trust replacing bank signatures. A rotating fund was established to assist families temporarily affected by job losses. Teachers volunteered evening classes to ensure students' scholarships remained intact. Instead of collapsing under pressure, Harlem began weaving itself tighter. But pressure tests character personally, too. One afternoon, Bumpy received a message that a meeting had been requested downtown by a business intermediary known to operate between communities. The man was polished, articulate, and careful with his words. He welcomed Bumpy into an office that smelled of leather and calculated neutrality. "We can make things easier," the intermediary said smoothly. "Lines of credit restored, supply chains normalized. But it requires a gesture." Bumpy remained silent. "A public statement," the intermediary continued, "encouraging reduced gatherings, less visible unity. Stability is good for business." There it was. Not violence, not threats. Silence for comfort. Bumpy leaned back slowly, considering. He understood negotiation, he understood leverage, but he also understood legacy. "And if we decline," he asked evenly. The intermediary's smile thinned. "Markets respond unpredictably." Bumpy rose to his feet without raising his voice. "Markets are not unpredictable, they're influenced, and influence shifts." He left without shaking hands. That evening, he walked through Harlem as dusk settled beneath them, watching children play stickball under street lamps. A young girl practiced piano scales through an open window. 2 elderly men debated politics on a stoop with animated gestures. None of them knew about the meeting downtown. None of them needed to. What they needed was consistency. Joe Louis returned to Harlem days later with unexpected news. A national magazine wanted to profile the rally and the cooperative efforts emerging in the neighborhood. Positive press, economic spotlight, public narrative shifting from unstable district to self-sustaining community. Exposure changes pressure dynamics. Once something is visible, it becomes harder to quietly undermine. The article was published weeks later, featuring photographs of local businesses, youth programs, and interviews with residents. Joe Louis was quoted speaking about disciplined unity. Bumpy was described not as a shadowy figure, but as a strategist focused on structural empowerment. Mamie was highlighted for her work mentoring young girls. Suddenly, Harlem was not a target of whispers, but a subject of admiration. And that altered calculations beyond the neighborhood. Financial institutions that had hesitated began restoring credit, wary of appearing discriminatory under public scrutiny. Suppliers resumed deliveries, citing logistical corrections. Insurance rates stabilized quietly. No apology was issued, none was expected, but the lesson had landed. Economic pressure loses potency when met with organized resilience and public transparency. One evening, as Bumpy and Mamie sat by their window watching the city hum beneath them, she spoke softly. "They thought grabbing my wrists was power," she said quietly, "but power is endurance." Bumpy nodded thoughtfully. Power is patience. It's choosing construction over reaction. Across town, Joe Louis trained in a quiet gym, preparing for another exhibition match. As he wrapped his hands, he reflected on something he had once learned in the ring. The opponent who throws the most punches doesn't always win. The one who controls rhythm does. Harlem had controlled rhythm. What began as a moment of disrespect had evolved into economic strategy, media visibility, and deeper unity. The men who had attempted to squeeze the neighborhood discovered something unsettling. Pressure applied to coal can create fracture, but it can also create diamond. And Harlem was hardening beautifully. 200 people had stood still in a ballroom. 1,000 had stood forward in the streets. Now an entire network stood woven together beneath the surface. But pressure rarely disappears completely. It waits, and in the waiting, character is revealed. The next challenge would not be financial, it would be personal, and it would test not just leadership, but sacrifice.